Hey guys, it's me, Dr. Ree, and in this video we're going to be looking at the cardiovascular system. So that is what this week's lab is all about. So we're going to kind of divide this video first into the heart, then into just blood vessels, and then looking at the actual circulatory systems. So looking at the heart, this is what the heart kind of looks like. Well, in a drawing, and in lab, we'll kind of look at both models on the anatomage as well as physical models of the heart. But this is a diagram. And I just want to talk a little bit about the cardiovascular system and how we kind of divide or what the blood does, right? So blood that goes into the heart, whoa, that's really large. Let's make that smaller. So blood that goes into the heart is deoxygenated because it's already given its oxygen to the cells. So it's coming back to the heart to get oxygen. So going into the heart is deoxygenated, and going out of the heart, we have oxygenated. And there's this pattern of how the blood flows, and that is something that you guys need to understand when we look at these different structures. So I want to understand these structures not by just pointing them out, but understanding what type of blood is there and where they're sending the blood next. So if we look here, starting, if we were saying, okay, blood's coming in, where's it coming in from? So blood comes in from our superior and inferior vena cava. So right here, this is my superior vena cava. And then down here, this is my inferior vena cava. You can abbreviate them V superior vena cava, V SVC, and then this one inferior vena cava, IVC. So blood is coming in there. That blood is going to pool into what we call our atrium. Now this is on the right side, so we call it our right atrium. So right here, this is our right atrium. So the blood's coming in, it goes to our right atrium. From our right atrium, it's going to go into our right ventricle. So we call this the right ventricle. That's where the blood is going next. And the valve that separates my right atrium from my right ventricle is going to be my right AV valve. The AV stands for atrioventricular. Sorry, my brain is just not there right now. Valve. We also sometimes can call this also our tricuspid valve. So that's what's connecting those two. And then from my right ventricle, when the heart pumps, that's going to send the blood up through my pulmonary valve. Into my pulmonary trunk. And my pulmonary trunk is going to be what sends everything out to the world. So it's going to, when things are leaving, we call them arteries. So these are my pulmonary arteries. Whoops. Arteries. They're going to go from the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. They're going to pick up some oxygen. And then from the lungs, it's going to come back and bring that blood back. Right here, what we're looking at are our pulmonary veins. So I switched to pink because now we're oxygenated. We got oxygen at the lungs. And we're going to fill here in my left atrium. Blood's going to go from my left atrium down into my left ventricle. The valve in between my left atrium and my left ventricle is called my left AV, atrioventricular valve, also known as my mitral valve. You need to know both names. And from there, heart pumps, and that's going to send up through the aortic valve into my aorta. That's what we're seeing right here. So right down here, let me get my little pointer. Right down here, this would be my ascending aorta. This right here is my aortic arch, and then as it goes back down, it would be called my descending aorta. So what's pointing right here is my aortic arch. And coming off of my aortic arch, I have 3 different projections. So the first one, the one that is all the way, now remember we're kind of switching this, so I'm looking at someone. So this would be all the way on the right. That's going to be my brachiocephalic trunk. And then as I go left, I have my left common carotid. And then I have my left subclavian. My brachiocephalic trunk will break into my right common carotid and then my right subclavian. When we get into blood vessels, we'll talk more about kind of where they break off from there. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. That's the general vibe, if you will, of the heart. And so what we're seeing here is the pink things are the things that have oxygenated blood, and the things that are blue have deoxygenated blood. And there's a few different ways that I draw this out that I will show you in class. But that is the general kind of flow of blood. Now, when we talk about the flow of blood, I have a picture. We'll get back to this in a second. But when I talk about the flow of blood, this is the general gist. So if we have the heart as in the middle, okay? So the blood from the heart is going to go into my arteries. My arteries are going to carry them throughout my body. And they're going to, as they give oxygen, they're going to go and give oxygen in our capillaries. They're very thin layers where exchange of the oxygen can happen. And then when they leave my capillaries, they're now going to be deoxygenated, and they're going to go back to the heart via veins. So that's kind of the little like continuum of circulation. Now I do have this image right here of a cardiac muscle. So let's just go over. We talked about muscle tissue in our second lab. So this is kind of throwing back to then. But just some things when we're looking at cardiac muscle compared to skeletal muscle and things like that is that we're seeing here we have our nuclei. Our nuclei are central when we talk about cardiac muscle. Here we see the branching. Branching only happens in cardiac muscle. That's because our heart is pumping as one unit. It's all happening at the same time. And that branching allows that. Specifically, these darker lines that we see here, those are our intercalated discs. And the intercalated discs are, again, what kind of connect our different cardiac cells together. So branching and the intercalated discs are 2 of those features that are really specific towards cardiac muscle and how you can tell the difference between cardiac muscle versus another type of muscle. So those are the main ideas here. Let's look a little bit further into when we talk about our blood vessels. Let me first draw out kind of a main idea of what I'm looking at when I'm looking at blood vessels. So like I said, we have veins and arteries. That's kind of our main breakdown of them. And so we have different types of veins and different types of arteries. So if I were to take this simplified and make it even more like the list of how things go. So I have my heart here. From my heart, I'll do it in pink. We start with our elastic arteries. From our elastic arteries, we become muscular arteries. And then from our muscular arteries, we have arterioles. The arterioles are what then connect, I'll do in yellow, to our capillaries. And then from our capillary, we're going to come back up through our venule. From our venule to our vein. And then from our vein to our large vein, like inferior vena cava and superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. And then that brings me back to my heart. So that was kind of my more expanded version of that list. Now, when we look at arteries versus veins, arteries are more structured and veins are a little more loosey-goosey. So when you're looking at histologic images, veins usually look kind of smushed. They both have 3 different types of layers found within them. So our first layer, so let me just draw a little bit. So I'm going to draw an artery first. And this is in general. Different ones of these will have different added layers and such. But just in general, when we look at an artery, around the outside of the artery, I'll draw it in yellow here. Around the outside of the artery, we have our tunica adventitia. Our tunica adventitia contains fibroblasts and is kind of our protective layer. We also have a little bit of endothelium, and we talked about endothelium in the past in our second lab, things like that. When we go inward more, sorry, I said endothelium here, not endothelium here. In the inside, we're going to have endothelium. That was my bad. So when I come inside more, my next layer is a muscular layer. And in arteries, our muscular layer is going to depend on what size artery we have. But I'm going to draw that in pink. And it's a fairly large, thick, muscular layer. And then we call that our tunica media, is where we have our muscular layer. So I think a media with muscular, M&M. So this is where we get smooth muscle cells, right? All of this, arteries and veins, are going to be smooth muscle cells. We're not cardiac. Cardiac is just in the heart. So this is all going to be smooth muscle, and that's our tunica media. And then our innermost layer is our tunica intima. Think of innermost, right? People that you're closest to, your inner circle, you get intimate with. Okay, so our tunica intima, which I have in blue here, that is a really thin layer that contains our endothelial cells. That's where endothelium kind of kicks in. And so that's kind of the main, like there you can see that thin layer. So there's my thin layer. So that's kind of what we're looking at in an artery. Now in a vein, very, very, very similar. But we just have a little less of each thing. So we still have a tunica adventitia, but typically we're not as strong, as in we don't have such a big structure. And I have a little smaller of this, and then this, I got a little bit of this. And then what we add in our vein is we have valves. And what our valves do in our vein is it prevents backflow, because valves go against gravity. And so because it's going against gravity, blood will like to pool downward. And so what this allows us to do is allows blood from our toes to get all the way back up to our heart. And the valves kind of stop that backflow from happening. So when we're thinking about that, what do the valves do? The valves react to movement. So that's why movement is really, really important to maintain your heart, like maintaining that circulation by moving, because it's going to help the valves bring that blood back and prevent pooling. So people who are bedridden will get really blown up feet and things like that. That's because we're getting increased pressure down there because we're pooling our blood. A capillary is just a thin layer of endothelium. So it has that endothelial cell. It doesn't really have a lot of else going on. So it's very, very thin. So our last little thing to look at today, and we're going to go again through more of this in lab, is just looking at our blood vessels that come outside of the heart. So when I leave the heart, where am I going? And when we look at this, there are so many blood vessels that we could go through. And so I'm going to focus on some of the main arteries and how kind of the flow works. Again, like I said, there are 1,000,001 things we could kind of focus on, but I'm going to try my best to focus on some of the main ones. So I'm going to draw them out. I'll do it in pink. So we already talked. This is that aortic arch. From our aortic arch, let's start with our brachiocephalic trunk. So that's what we have right here. Our brachiocephalic trunk is going to come off and it's going to go up and down into our arm. So it's called the brachiocephalic trunk here. But then as it continues up and through, we're going to have it break off, and that's where we're going to get our common carotid. So it breaks off, and this becomes our common carotid, our right common carotid. And that right common carotid is eventually also then going to break off into having our vertebral artery. So we have a vertebral artery, our common carotid artery, and that common carotid will eventually then break off into an internal and external common carotid. Whoa, a lot happening. That also happens here. Here's that left common carotid. It breaks off. We also have a vertebral break off, and then we have that left common carotid break off into an internal and external common carotid. All right, so back into here. So that was our first break off from our brachiocephalic trunk. After we have our common carotid break off, we call this the right subclavian. Once it reaches the axillary region, we now call it the axillary. So it was brachiocephalic, then it's now called axillary. Still the same artery. From the axillary, it's going to become or be called the brachial when it reaches the arm. And it'll continue down until it splits into my radial and ulnar arteries. My ulnar is going to be on the ulna side, and then the radial will be on the other side. And then that's going to become a palmar arch, and that's how we kind of get blood out. And then we have digital arteries. So that's kind of what we're looking at there a little bit with our arteries in that region. Now, on this side, we just start with our subclavian. It's going to become axillary, then it's going to become brachial, and then it's going to divide into the ulnar, radial, palmar arches, digital arteries. So you see that kind of on both sides. Now, we have also coming down here our descending aorta. So this usually goes right under or behind the heart from our aortic arch. So besides the stuff that kind of split up there. So our descending aorta is going to continue down through. And so we have our descending aorta, and here's our diaphragm. And once it passes our diaphragm, we typically call it our abdominal aorta. So it's kind of descending throughout our thoracic region. We have some things that go out into the ribs and things like that. And then we call it our abdominal aorta. Coming off of our abdominal aorta, we have a few different things. We have our celiac trunk. As we continue down, we're going to have our renal, right? It's going to go to their kidneys. So we have our renals. So if I drew a little kidney there, there's my kidney. That's where the renals go. We also have our superior mesenteric at the same level as the renal. And then as we continue down through, we have our inferior mesenteric. Now, don't worry too much about these big ones for lab. Those might be things that are asked in lecture. That abdominal aorta is going to divide into our iliacs, our common iliacs. So it divides into two, which are known as our common iliacs. And then my common iliac is then going to divide into an internal iliac and an external iliac. I was a little high because once that external iliac reaches the thigh region, we now are going to call it the femoral artery. Now, when we're looking at that, we can kind of see the femoral artery is going to come here, and then it's going to wrap down and around. We're going to have a break off from there. That's going to become our posterior tibial and our anterior tibial, as well as our fibular. So we kind of have break offs that are coming through that whole thing. And then those are going to come on down and through and create our plantar arches and our dorsal pedalis. So that's just a general idea. I know that's a lot going on there. But, so now, what about veins? How are my veins going to differ from this? So when we look at our veins, I'm going to just kind of start with my feet and move my way up. So from my feet, I have my arches that we had. We have our dorsal venous arches. So those are going to be our veins that are kind of collecting blood there. We have coming all the way on that medial side, all the way up, that whole area, that is going to be my great saphenous vein. So the complete medial going all the way up, that's our great saphenous. I just misspelled that. That has a PH. Saphenous vein. Now all the way laterally, we have our small saphenous. And then next to that, we have our fibular. And then we also have an anterior and posterior tibial. Again, my drawing, you can't really differentiate it, but when we look at the models on the anatomage, that'll be easier to see. Those, when it's behind the knee, we call it the popliteal vein. And then as we continue back up and through, that's going to become our femoral vein. Now the great saphenous and the femoral are going to come together into my external iliac. I also had an internal iliac that's collecting blood from where that internal artery was. And those are going to come together into my common iliac. So right here, that's my common iliac vein. From there, it's going to continue. Blood is going to continue up and through this region. We have renal veins in this area. We have gonadal veins in this area. We call this, though, instead of the abdominal aorta, this is called, from here on up after the common iliac, that is all inferior vena cava. It continues to be the inferior vena cava this whole way until it reaches the atrium, that right atrium. So there's the hepatic veins. There's a few other veins. We're not going to worry too much about them right now, but that's where it happens. Now, what about from the top? So from the top, we have our jugulars. We have an external and internal jugular. And those are both going to come and meet in the middle from our brachiocephalic veins. So brachiocephalic veins on either side. We have a left and a right one. We call it kind of the same. So it's called brachiocephalic when it's in this region. It's called subclavian when it's in this region. And then it's called our axillary and then our brachial as we continue through. So see how one vein based on where its location is. So brachiocephalic, subclavian, axillary, brachial. And that brachial, just like we saw before, is going to be where my radial and ulnar kind of come together. Now we do have a couple of extra veins also happening in our arm that we didn't have on the other side, or haven't with our arteries, and that is our cephalic vein. The cephalic vein is going to run on the lateral aspect. So this is my cephalic and it runs all the way down. We also have a few other ones. We also have a basilic. So our brachial is going to break off into and have this kind of little outcrop called our basilic vein. Now these veins are important because we get blood from our veins from these regions. And so it's kind of nice to know where they are because if you were to take blood, these are the different ones that you'd be looking for to learn kind of how to find them. And we still have our palmar arches, our digital veins, and things like that. And then that would all go, our brachiocephalic trunk would then go to the superior vena cava. which we see there. Now, I know that's a lot, and I know on this drawing it was probably really confusing, hopefully just kind of seeing a little bit of a drawing and having me explain where they are. Use this, look at models in your textbook, and in lab we'll be looking even more into all of these. In your post-lab, you will be identifying on 2 different drawings these arteries and these veins, so you can also use this as a practice of using those and trying to find them on those actual models on your post-lab. I will see you guys in class, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.